Okay.
Perfect. All right. Welcome everybody to tonight's Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee for today is the 18th. Um, we will be starting off. Let's see, I've got an agenda from May 16th, but it looks like the right agenda. Maybe it was just dated wrong.
Um, oh yeah, you're right. It is dated wrong. That's should be the correct agenda
Okay, good. Well, then I'll go off there. I was just looking at it. I was going, wait, May 18th. That's not right. So we will note that in the minutes next time to change that. But in the meantime, I think we all know our meeting protocols. Um, is there anybody from the public attending? Does it look like?
We're not taking public comment at meetings right now, but folks are encouraged to submit any written comment to staff, and we'll share that back with you. We have not gotten any written comment to share with ETAC for this meeting.
All right, great. And then I guess the next item for us to go through would be the approval of the Zoom meeting summary. Does anybody have any comments or changes for that? If not, I will entertain a motion to approve the meeting summary.
I make a motion to approve.
And a second from someone? All right, all in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Howard?
I'm abstaining since I wasn't at the meeting.
Very well, great. Did we get a count on that or close enough?
You got that, Stuart? Yes, sounds like it. Thanks.
Then I am gonna pass it off to staff to take us into our presentation on the redevelopment analysis.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks everybody for being here, and thanks for bearing with me since I don't have Heather and Elena here to run this meeting with you all. So I think I've met all of you at this point. Leah Rausch, I'm a senior planner with community planning and design. Stuart Warren and Terry Harding on our team are also sitting in tonight. I am mostly just going to hand it over to our partner at Echo Northwest, Becky Hewitt. We came to you all in April to present on kind of some initial updates on this redevelopment analysis in the study areas and kind of the connection to climate friendly areas designation. So her team have been hard at work working through the results and have a lot of good information to share with you. The slide deck that Becky's going to go through tonight is linked in your meeting materials folder. So you're welcome to, if you didn't look at that before the meeting, to follow along there or to look more closely at all these good results after the meeting. So with that, Becky, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Nice to see folks again. Becky Hewitt, I'm a project director at Echo Northwest. I'm going to share, yeah, I'm assuming I'm sharing the slides. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to start with just a little recap of some of what we had talked about last time, just to make sure everybody's back up to speed. And then we'll jump pretty quickly into the new information that we have to share. So that's what I just said. So what we heard before and what we had done when we talked to you before. So we picked out some different development prototypes, meaning example developments that are sort of illustrative of the type of thing you might get in this area, and focused in on the specific areas based on input from staff, did some market research, did some developer interviews. We shared the themes from those developer interviews with you at the last meeting, but the big takeaways were that the amenities matter in driving what the rents are and the desire to invest in these places, that development overall is pretty tough right now, and that that can change over time, but like this exact moment is kind of a tough time for moving development forward. and that reducing parking ratios, even if the city's not requiring parking, that there's still, the market is still likely to provide some parking. So we can't just assume that parking is not part of future development. This is a recap of something we shared before, but with a little more detail, that the types of development we're testing. So you're going to see results for these different types of development. One thing I wanted to make sure was clear, we're testing something we're calling storefront commercial as well as freestanding commercial. And those are not like things that everybody just intuitively knows exactly what that means. So storefront commercial meaning like kind of it's up next to the sidewalk. It's got, you know, maybe the big glass windows on the front. Maybe doesn't have its own parking. Doesn't have a lot of setbacks. Kind of smaller sites or smaller buildings, maybe next to each other. And then freestanding commercial might be like your Walgreens or something like that. That's just like about a 20,000 square foot building with its own parking lot, either next to it or, you know, whatever. So that's kind of the distinction between those things. The storefront commercial assumes kind of a more walkable form. The freestanding commercial, even if the parking is to the side or behind, is you know, it's more dependent on people being able to like drive and park in the parking lot. We're looking at townhouses. We tested both a form that would work for like an infill site. We don't need new roads, and then because some of our areas have very large sites, we also looked at what if you needed to like build out a local road network in order to be able to develop townhouses. We looked at garden apartments, 3 stories, you know, with more landscaping and parking and amenities, as well as compact walk-up apartments that are pretty, you know, it's just like the building, maybe a little bit of parking, not a lot of landscaping, no like pool or tot lot or any of that stuff like you might have in the garden apartment. So kind of just the apartment building, a little bit of parking, a little bit of, you know, basic landscaping. And then elevator apartments, 5 to 6 stories, pretty self-explanatory. Mixed use, meaning that it would have some commercial on the ground floor, and then student-oriented housing, 12-story, similar to some of the stuff that's been built recently near the university. And so the elements that go into the feasibility analysis are rents and costs, the existing property sizes and values, and then some policy variables, including incentives. So our analysis, technically we are looking at changes to regulations, and we can talk about how changes to market would influence things, but the specific things that we really tested as part of the analysis we have done so far are actually about the financial incentive. So we tested expanding MUPD into new areas. We have not done very detailed testing of like, what if you changed the program criteria for MUPD? What if you made it a little easier? What if you removed this requirement? I will say that our modeling for MUPD right now is a little maybe simplified. It assumes there's some additional cost of going through the process of applying because of the time it would take. There's some additional cost of the various public benefit requirements, but we haven't modeled them all out in, you know, because there's some variability in what people might choose to do. We haven't modeled out all those details. We're mostly focused on sort of the broad strokes of the benefit of the tax abatement and a little bit of cost to get it. We also tested fee assistance in the downtown area. So because we're then going to walk through a bunch of charts, I'm going to kind of introduce how to read these charts and explain it a little bit so that when we see a bunch of charts in a minute, they make some sense. The key thing we're measuring is called residual land value. And that's basically just how much can a developer afford to spend on land, given everything, how much everything else is likely to cost them, and given what the value of the development is likely to be, and given the fact that they need to make some return in order for it to be worth it for them. So residual land value is just a fancy phrase that means how much they can spend on acquiring a place to build. That residual land value gets compared to the existing market value of the site. So if there's a piece of property and it's an acre and it's valued at $3 million, we're comparing, can the development afford to spend $3 million an acre to acquire property? If they can, then that is more likely to be feasible. And if they can't, then it is not feasible. So the way that we have presented these results, this land budget per square foot, that's the residual land value, divided by the square footage of the property, just as a way to compare small versus large site more easily. If it is a negative number, then the development is not feasible in current market conditions, even if you gave them the land for free. You would have to give them land and a bag of money in order to move forward. If the residual land value is a small positive number, maybe in this kind of range down here, then it's feasible if they have a low value site. That's more likely to be the case if it's vacant. Maybe there's some underutilized sites that are in that range, but that's kind of like only really works if the existing value of the property is pretty low. If you get up higher up here, you're getting into a range where maybe you can afford to pay for a building or a site that already has a building on it, even if you don't want that building and you're going to tear it down and you're going to replace it with something else. So that's where redevelopment would be more likely to be feasible. I might, Leah, I might pause there just to see if folks are tracking, so that, because again, the rest of this won't make a lot of sense if you're not with me so far. So does anyone have questions on kind of what kind of data we're looking at, what kind of results we're looking at?
Any questions?
Okay.
So basically on the charts coming up, if they go below the not feasible, even if land was free, then that's basically a no build type of a piece of property.
If they're below, so if a given type of development has a negative number for residual land value, that means current market conditions, current costs, not going to happen unless there's some subsidy. Something would need to change for that to be viable, even on vacant land, even on free land. If it's if you see a small positive bar, that's like, maybe if you had a cheap site. And if you see a big positive bar, now we might be talking redevelopment potential.
And I guess the only question that I would have about that is, what about changes of use? So if I've got we've seen that the development happened here in Eugene. So we had like a bank that was, banks are shrinking down and not having it. That turned into a convenience store and gas station. So is the higher and better uses put into these, or are you just putting that as retail?
So I'm not 100% sure this is answering your question, but I'll try. And then you can tell me if I'm not quite answering your question. So we're not looking at keeping the same building and putting something different into it.
Right.
We're assuming in that situation, you buy the building with the bank, you scrape off the bank, and then you put a new building on it. And if whatever I'm replacing it with, whether that's a convenience store or a gas station or an apartment building, if when we run the numbers, it looks like that thing can afford to buy a site with a bank on it, scrape the bank off and build their thing instead, then it gets a positive, that it would show up here in this range, in that situation.
So I guess what I was getting to is, if it's in an area of town where the use of the building used to be of value, but now that value is no longer there, but there is value for a different type of use, is that factored in at all?
That's a good question. So the way we are looking at the value of the existing site, which I think is kind of what you're getting to, is like, what is the value of that bank building? Is basically just based on the assessor. That is not a perfect indicator. The assessor does not have perfect information about the value of that site. It's not a great proxy for what would it sell for if it came to market, but it's a readily available piece of information, and it's probably in the ballpark much of the time. It's the best we have, basically, to be able to estimate. So that's what we're using.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody
All
else have a
right.
question? I can't see everybody, so just holler if you do.
Okay. So then as we go through this, we'll come back to these questions, but as we go through this, these are the things that we want you to be thinking about. Does what we're doing make sense? Are any of these results surprising to you? Does any of this seem like, that's not what I would have expected? And if so, what's surprising about it? What kind of follow-up questions do you have for us? And is there anything that you want the city or project team, Echo, to consider as we kind of wrap up this analysis? So that's what we're going to come back to at the end. Okay, so first part of our results. What types of development are most feasible in each area? So I'm going to walk through each of these areas. I've got a little recap of things we heard from developer interviews, a map that shows the existing property values, again, divided by square feet so that we can compare smaller and larger properties. And then we go through the actual results that we found. So downtown core and greater downtown, we had heard some concerns about, especially in the downtown core, not really high commercial rents, not really seen as an attraction. You have pretty high existing property values, just to explain these maps. So the darker blue here means higher value, lighter blue means lower value on a per square foot basis. So basically the lighter colored parcels here are the ones that are lower value on a per square foot basis. The kind of light yellow are ones that were excluded because they're either zero value or they were flagged as not having any developable land, even after accounting for like the ones that just have a building on them were fine, but some of these were excluded as not being developable in public ownership or whatever. So, okay, here's the charts that show the results, and I'll explain this a little bit too. So if you remember, negative numbers, not feasible if land is free. Small bars, possible and low value sites. Bigger bars, more likely to be feasible. These colors are different types of developments. We've got our two different types of commercial, storefront and freestanding, that are two different scales of townhouses, garden apartments, walk-up apartments, elevator, mixed use, and student housing. This other line up here is just sort of a reference point. The 10th percentile of the existing land values in that area. So that means in the downtown core, 10% of properties existing value from the assessor per square foot is under about the $75 per square foot line. That's kind of a reference point because that kind of sets like what is a comparatively low value site in this area. If you have a bar that is taller than that, there might be some sites that that would be like roughly 10% of sites might be feasible for development. Kind of, it doesn't take size and everything else into consideration, but it's a rough indication of is redevelopment in this area possible given existing property values and the market conditions. So this area, lots of things have positive bars, but they're not very big positive bars. They're probably not high enough to mean much, if any, redevelopment potential, given where the existing land values are. There could be one or two sites that are low value, but it's not very much that we're looking at here. This baseline includes our sort of rough assessment of the existing MUPD program that is already in place in the downtown core. So in this case, the baseline has MUPD in it. Still not seeing a lot of additional redevelopment potential in the downtown core. We tested with fee assistance added on top of that. We assumed it would apply to everything except student housing, I think. I think we took student housing off of this. Better, but still not necessarily enough to really see a lot of redevelopment. Greater downtown with existing MUPD, you've got things that are closer to being feasible here. and the higher density is more feasible. Student apartments, I'm sorry, I'm realizing we made a couple of tweaks on the student apartments specifically and then did not update the text to reflect them. So I apologize for that. The student apartments, just to explain what was going on there, the highest rents that you see for student apartments make them very, very feasible in this greater downtown. If the greater downtown area was able to hit those same rents of what you see in the existing ones, they would be very feasible. When we took another look at the map of the kind of sites in greater downtown that we're talking about, we're like, this really isn't that close to the university. We don't think that this area, like there might be one or two sites that are on the closest side to the university that could hit those rents, but most of this area is not going to hit that same rent. It's not close enough to the university. And so we knocked their rents down a little bit, and that brought that student housing bar down relative to what we had in there. So that's the reason for that change.
Becky, the slides that you're showing us are different than the slides that you sent out or that were a part of our packages. The ones that we have are slightly higher.
Hold on a second. Let me stop sharing that for a second. Sorry, we had a version control issue on our end where I thought that was the last version. We did, like I said, we did make some changes right in the last couple of days as we were looking again at the student housing on the map. There we go. And I'll have to check if something else changed because the rest of it I don't think was intended to change.
Yeah, almost all of your charts were a little lower than the ones that we've got.
That is the version. So I will note the student housing, student housing one, that is going to change when we go back through this.
Okay, that's the same charts I have. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So this was greater downtown with MUPD, and then again, ignore that student housing bar. And then if you add fee assistance, that helps the higher density and mixed use be able to be more likely to be feasible for redevelopment. 6th and 7th Avenues, we heard some mixed reviews on those and concerns about kind of the streetscape environment. Mix of property values, mix of sizes here, property sizes. In this area in the baseline, there wasn't a lot that looked feasible, but some things might be close. So freestanding commercial, maybe the smaller townhouse infill and compact walk-up apartments came closest there. That's in the baseline. And then with MUPD, if we assume it applies to the compact walk-up apartments, then that would potentially bump them up enough that they might be feasible for redevelopment in some situations. West 11th Avenue, we heard, again, some concerns about the street itself, and then also about the businesses that are currently operating there and whether this is a place that would be great to have additional residential. The area south of the creek that we heard would be better for housing is not part of this actual analysis area, is not zoned C2, but we go all the way, we go down to that, just down to the creek. In this area, it's kind of a similar story. A few things that might be feasible, and maybe the townhouses, and then some of the medium density multifamily. We assumed that MUPD would not apply to garden apartments based on their density, that the city, right now, the city has requirements for MUPD that are about encouraging higher density housing. And so in these, we've assumed that the garden apartments would not be eligible for MUPD, and so it doesn't change them. But we did assume it would apply to the compact walk-up because even though they're only 3-story, they're actually a decent density. So we've assumed that they would be eligible. So if you assume that, then the compact walk-ups, it does help. The higher density, it's not enough. They're still not enough to hit likely feasibility. Midtown, we heard some positive things about this area, but it's also got relatively small properties and relatively higher existing property values. The baseline here, we got pretty positive results, but you've also got relatively higher existing land values. So place where you might see investment and interest, but not necessarily a lot of sites that would be tear down redevelopment under existing conditions. And then with MUPD, that would support higher density multifamily potentially on at least some sites in this area. South Willamette, we heard it's pretty desirable, had some good access to amenities, relatively higher rents. Again, also relatively higher property values, some smaller sites with kind of more moderate, but not real low property values. The baseline, again, mostly positive, but not quite up to where that 10th percentile mark is. So maybe not feasible for tear down redevelopment in this area. With MUPD, again, kind of similar to Midtown, pushes that higher density multifamily to be potentially feasible for redevelopment and the most feasible option. Lower Coburg, Ferry Street area, heard some good things here too. Some concerns about the roads as a problem to get around, make them a little less walkable, but there's been some recent residential development there. And the property values, there's enough of this that isn't super high value. I'll say there's a few weird things with the way that the parcel lines are in this area where it's like, this parcel is a parking lot that clearly goes with the building that's on a different parcel. And so there's some weird things about like whether an individual tax lot here is really redevelopable on its own to the extent that it might look like. But some of these are lower value. And so that area looked like it had maybe some more potential for additional redevelopment. And with MUPD, even more so, and it kind of supports the higher density development more. Valley River Center, this area you've got the mall. It's got a lot of parking lots. The extent of kind of greenway impacts on that site, I don't know if they are fully accounted for in the mapping that we have. But you've got some lower value kind of parking lot areas theoretically. And this area, you might see some things that are feasible, but right now, the way we think the market conditions are in that area, the lower density is looking a little stronger than some of the higher density. So maybe could see some redevelopment there if they were to repurpose parts of the mall. But it's, may or may not make sense to go to the highest density. With MUPD, that helps support higher density and could make it more likely to be feasible to redevelop parts of that area. Santa Clara Station, in this area, you can see the actual, the station property itself is excluded from this. I know there is development potential on that site. It's not being analyzed here because it's currently in public ownership. So its taxable value is not a good indicator of its redevelopment potential. And so in that baseline, you've got, again, kind of like the lower density end of the range is more likely to be feasible. And with MUPD, it brings the 5 and 6 story stuff up. Maybe that makes the taller stuff work. Highway 99 is a tough area. The existing property values are very low. That's partly a reflection of the desirability and partly a reflection of the level of intensity of development on those sites. And so there are a lot of negative numbers in terms of feasibility for this area, but because the property values are very low, there are also some things that in theory might be feasible. I will say commercial to commercial redevelopment in an area like this is, it's like maybe theoretically possible, but it would be a question of whether it was like really worth it, like, would you be better off just to repurpose the space you have if it's just commercial to commercial? So the commercial looks like it would be feasible, but I think that might kind of overstate how much would actually make sense to do. And you might, maybe some of the townhouses or compact apartments. I think the property values are very low. I think the desire to build here is also pretty low. So it could work on paper. I think you'd have to have the right site to make residential feel like a good choice out there. With MUPD, it doesn't really help anything tall. It might make the compact apartments more compelling, but more financially feasible. Still, I think you have the challenge of this doesn't assume very high rents, but I think just the kind of interest in development in this area, I think you might need something to make the area feel more desirable as well, before developers would want to invest in that area. Barger Drive, not a lot of actual properties out here, and the ones that are, again, you've got it basically just like a couple sites, and the way the parcel lines are broken up is a little strange relative to what's on the ground. It's a kind of big box commercial area right now. The residual land values are kind of similar to Highway 99, but because the value of what's in place, or it's not as low value of existing development, so it might not be enough to make those couple of sites turn over and redevelop. And even with MUPD, it's probably not enough. I have a couple more slides that are kind of like more thematic than by area, and then we'll take your comments. So these ones are focused on what does this tell us about the ability to deliver density and mixed use in any of these areas. So what's making the higher density types feasible depends on higher rent areas. So in a higher rent area, like this is Midtown as an example, and just focusing in on a couple of these, the higher density is increasing feasibility, because your rents are high enough that building more apartments is better, and they can cover the higher cost associated with going to 5 and 6 stories and putting in elevators. In a lower rent area, the higher density makes things worse. You've got the elevator, it's more expensive to build at that height, your rents aren't enough, and so you're losing more money as you go up. And so it's not helping. For ground floor retail, stronger retail areas are obviously going to be better, but what we saw is, given what we heard about retail rents, that generally ground floor retail is going to decrease feasibility compared to building residential only development. And I would say the exception, that's sort of the broad strokes answer. There are exceptions, like in some places, putting in the ground floor retail creates an amenity that helps the residential rents, makes for higher residential rents. And so it might make sense in that situation. Or if you're in a place where your ground floor units are going to get really low rents because it's really not a nice place to live on the ground floor, you might put commercial in because you're not going to be able to lease those ground floor residential units really anyway, so commercial is better. So the broad strokes answer, it's generally not helpful for feasibility, but there might be situations and kind of site specific things where it is helpful. And that's mostly just because of the cost of putting the residential above commercial versus, and then the rent associated with the commercial doesn't outweigh the additional cost of building it compared to just doing residential. So MUPD is a pretty powerful incentive program. And I mean, one can add a lot of requirements onto it. And depending on how many requirements you add onto it, those can, absorb some or all of the value of that incentive. But assuming that the requirements for public benefits are not too high, it is a pretty powerful incentive. And when it can help higher density more. So that can be, especially, I mean, the way that Eugene has it structured, it is targeted towards higher density as well as financially helping higher density, but there's ways to use it to support higher density development, even if that's, not inherently what it would do on its own, but it also tends to, if for these areas that are kind of borderline, whether the higher density works, it tends to boost up the higher density a little bit more. And so if we look at which areas are you most likely to see the current market support higher density and vertical mixed use, with the current policies, I would say Greater Downtown and Lower Coburg Road are the kind of closest, the most feasibility for the higher density and for vertical mixed use. If you bring in additional incentives, if you were to add MUPD, Midtown, South Willamette, and Valley River Center all looked like they would be pretty promising as well. Other areas might not make sense for vertical mixed use, but they might make sense for horizontal mixed use. And so right now, Santa Clara Station, Valley River Center, West 11th all look like they might support some additional vertical mixed use potentially. And with additional incentives, maybe 6th and 7th Avenue, maybe Highway 99 could make some sense for horizontal mixed use. And then other things the city could do to support higher intensity mixed use development. I think the big one here is really kind of outside of all of the things that our analysis was sort of built to look at, which is what can you do to make these areas more desirable? A lot of what we heard and a lot of what is, maybe constraining rents in these areas is about the amenities, the street context. What is it like to live in this area? Would anyone actually want to rent an apartment there? And so I think that even if the zoning changes you would need to make to identify these places as climate friendly areas are not that great, I think that thinking about the types of places that you would want to make these type of improvements to, like that, those are the things that would support would support the higher density, would support the mixed use development, that would support them developing into places that might look like what you would think a climate friendly area should be. And then there are also some other financial incentives that the city could consider. Vertical housing development zones are a tax incentive that is specifically for vertical mixed use development. And then SDC reductions, targeted SDC reductions. The city has some SDC reduction programs in place, but could potentially adjust how those work. So those are some other things that might have an impact as well. And then we're back to our questions for you all, and I will take this down in a second so folks can see each other better. But just as a quick reminder, we're looking for, does this make sense to you? Did anything surprise you about these results? What other questions do you have? And is there anything else you want us to be thinking about?
Great, thank you for the presentation. Sue.
Well, what I was thinking the whole time I was looking at this before the meeting and then hearing your presentation is it would be an excellent class. And Jennifer, I hope you don't take offense at this. It would be an excellent class seminar for City Council because I'm just thinking back on all the years when it was such a struggle to get the City Council to understand the importance of MUPTI and how difficult it is to develop, how expensive it is, and there's always been this perception that developers just are rich and they make money bags on everything they do. And you just have to look at Broadway Place as an example of where that's not the case. It's 20 years old now. And just recently, one of the last retail spaces leased, which is, amazing. So I think this is an incredible educational tool. And I strongly advise somehow figuring out a way to do a presentation to City Council with it because it really lays out the truth of what it's like to develop and what it takes to develop successfully. Thank you.
Right. Phil? I'm sure you have something to say.
Yeah, I do. I was just about to raise my virtual hand here. I have a question. First off, maybe Becky, could you just give me a little bit of kind of what was the thinking behind some of the boundaries that were done? You did lower Coburg Road and Ferry Street Bridge, but not the entirety of it. But yet you did do virtually the entirety of West 11th or of Highway 99. And I would think, almost like without even seeing your analysis and having gone through it, I probably could have guessed that those would have been maybe the results that you would have gotten. There may be value in walkability and in conversion of properties and, some of these benefits we want to see out of, climate-friendly areas in the northern Coburg Road area. And so what was kind of the basis for where boundary lines were drawn?
I'm going to let Leah answer that. I will say, I'll let her give the more detailed answer. I will say I know that C2 zoning was a key factor in, is like, for example, I mentioned, this isn't your exact example, but I mentioned on West 11th, like we ignore the area south of the river because it's not got C2 zoning. And so that was part of it, but I'll let Leah add on a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. We started with the areas that we identified in the climate friendly areas study, which is inclusive of these areas, but is also includes several more that were not in the redevelopment analysis. Given our limited scope and budget with ECHO, we kind of narrowed to the existing C2 zoning. So we excluded some areas that have special area zones or were high density residential the code changes would look a lot more significant if these areas were designated as climate friendly areas. And that's not to say that they're off the table by any means for climate friendly areas, but just to narrow the scope of this kind of actual analysis of all these different development prototypes, knowing that C2 zoning is really our most permissible zone. I think Crescent Village area you're talking about, like north on River Road.
No, I'm talking about the area of Coburg Road north of your lower Coburg Road area, which is largely C2.
Yeah.
Both sides of the street going all the way up to Beltline. And I would have guessed that would have just been an easier area to analyze and include than say Barger. Or if you had to trim, I would have trimmed one of these other areas that just don't, I would have guessed that they would have been a harder lift. Land values are lower, rents are lower. It's just going to be harder.
It's good feedback. So a flaw I would say in the CFA study initially was that a lot of the initial areas were based on existing frequent transit access. And so actually a lot of North Eugene didn't get included because of that. But I think to your point, the zoning is there. There may be the potential there. So we're trying to bring some of those areas back in as we pursue the CFA selection. So that's good feedback, Phil, for sure.
Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. And Phil actually asked my one question, which Coburg is in my area. So I'm glad someone else asked it, so I don't have to look like I'm being selecting my own area for questions. But I wanted to also back up what Sue said. You know, I personally think MUPD is a great tool, but as everyone knows, like every time we bring one forward, there are people on council who need to have the conversation about how they don't like it and it's terrible and blah, blah, blah. But I think this presentation really highlights how useful it can be, which might be helpful for some folks. But even more, what I liked about these slides is, you know, you can know that something's going to be helpful and you want to use it to be helpful, but this really showed you exactly like where its limitations were. Like, yeah, it's helping, but that maybe if you're still not getting to your goal, then like you need to do more, or you need to take a different strategy. And this really showed you very, like, in a more detailed way than I've ever seen at council, like how much of an impact these things are estimated to have, right? We don't have a crystal ball, but that's really helpful in a way I haven't seen before, and I think would be very interesting to our entire community, to be honest. But yeah.
Right. Howard.
Yeah, very good presentation. It certainly was very informative for me that's not involved in, never been involved in development. I guess I don't know if it's the next step or not, but I guess I'd be curious as to looking at some of the higher potential development areas, which in my mind is kind of depressing because there's a lot of negatives there. But I'd like to understand, looking at this analysis, and how does that move the needle toward determining future land needs and how that's going to be met. You know, based on this analysis for high density residential and commercial, all that, can it be met in these areas right now, given all the negatives? I mean, we know about construction costs and land and infrastructure limits. I think the perception of unhoused is a lot bigger driver on market demand. I wouldn't discount that at all, and it, you know, kind of, in my mind, kind of sugarcoat that a little bit. So I think there's a lot of issues, and it's concerning to me as to how we're going to meet the desire for high density when it, at least from my layperson's viewpoint, it doesn't seem to be a lot of opportunities out there given the constraints. Thanks.
Yep. Mark.
I'm intrigued as before and dismayed about the mass transit not being a particularly attractive feature. I mean, that was one of the early points in the presentation, and the access to higher speed mass transit, like in the Eugene area, BRT. And I guess sort of one basic question I would have is whether the absence of that being the absence of that being regarded as a very positive thing is a reflection of hard data based on the analysis of what difference, if any, BRT has made, the existing BRT has made, versus hunches and feelings, and to what extent that criterion needs more time, like 5 years maybe, to play out to really understand it better. And I'm, you know, for me, of course, I'm hoping to see that as a more positive thing than it appears to be at this point.
I can speak to that a little bit. Actually, not really from work we did on this project, but from work that Echo did on the River Road. I forget its actual name now, community something. The River Road, what we shorthanded as the River Road Corridor Study. And we did a literature review as part of that project, and I'm probably gonna not get the number exactly right, but we looked at various studies. That I think one of them was on some of LTD's early bus rapid transit corridors. I think there was one local study and then several other national ones trying to estimate the impact of BRT on rents and property values and things like that. I think it was in the neighborhood of 3%, like as a sort of estimated impact, which isn't nothing. A 3% difference in rent, in my having played with a lot of pro formas, sometimes is enough to make the difference of whether things work or not. But it's not massive. And what the other thing, this is going from memory, so I would want to sort of circle back, check that report and make sure that I've got this right. But I believe that when we've looked at this on other projects, that most of that in terms of when would you see that show up, that's mostly about the premium that new construction can charge, and you would see it show up like if developers know that the BRT is coming, like it's definitely, it's in progress, that like the next apartment building that gets built in that area, like they're already pricing it in, whether that, you know what I mean? So like from the time it's sort of the improvements are happening to make BRT happen, it starts getting priced into the new development that happens along that corridor. So the development itself might take time to materialize, because sites don't all come available at once, and you know, maybe the overall market conditions weren't strong enough, and so maybe over time that amenity plus the overall market conditions is enough to make some more redevelopment happen. But I would say that the value of transit has taken a hit post-COVID, and I'm not aware of, I'd have to check with other folks at ECHO, I'm not aware of any more recent studies that try to estimate the impact, like post-COVID studies that try to estimate the impact of transit on rents or property values. I suspect it would be less. So I think that is, you know, things are kind of, people are starting to ride buses again. It's, you know, coming back around some. And it's not nothing. It's not an amenity. It's just not necessarily like the major difference maker. It's like kind of at the margins. If you're on the bubble, it's helpful. And maybe it helps you justify a slightly lower parking ratio because you're like, but the bus is right out front. So there's other places where it can kind of at the margins make things a little more feasible for higher density, even if it's not like a huge impact to the rents that you can achieve.
Right. So I put myself in line here, and I'm kind of going back to echo kind of what Sue said, and being able to express to council and to our community as a whole the value that MUPTI has. You know, if you look up a couple slides, it says what else might support higher intensity mixed use developments, and it's streetscape improvements, amenities, trails and parks, storefront improvements, pedestrian and bike connectivity. Those are all things that cost a lot of money and would, you know, it's like the city is struggling for money as it is right now. So to say, oh yes, if you fix the streets and all of that, then maybe development will happen. Whereas if you use MUPTI, which is really a no cost because you're just deferring the taxes, you're not writing a check for these things, then you're getting new development. Usually new development is nicer streetscapes, more amenities, those types of things. So it's chicken and egg. If we offer MUPTI in more areas, and to me, you know, we know that there's a need for housing, and the one tool that the city has that they don't have to write a check for is MUPTI. And so why wouldn't we try and get MUPTI in as many areas as is possible to see if that's going to be the lever that will get these developers to do it. And if it's in Midtown, that's great. Housing anywhere in this community is what we need. And to do it in those areas, that are less impactful to the city's budget just makes so much sense. So I really agree that if we could get this type of data in front of council, even if it's one-on-ones, you know, I think it would be really important, especially given the timing that the MUPD conversation is having at the table right now. If they could see this and say, well, yeah, it does make a difference. And we don't have to just concentrate on downtown. We need housing in all areas of our community. So that's just my 2 cents.
Well, this might be a good time for me to talk a little bit about next steps, but I don't want to cut off questions if there are still some, or feedback for Becky.
Do you want me to put that slide up,
Rick,
Leah?
hold on. We haven't heard from Rick yet.
Yeah.
I would really like to.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm happy that Becky brought up the streetscapes and stuff as well as you, John, because that's been a concern of mine for a while. I've had some new tenants recently move in. Actually, both of them are associate professors up at the university, and both commented that they were surprised the lack of public care of our public areas, which kind of surprised me. And I didn't realize it until I started thinking about it as I drove around town, and I look at the green spaces, particularly the separations of traffic lanes and so on, and how we build them and yet we don't maintain them. They just go to weeds and so forth. Back to Becky's presentation, I appreciate it a lot. The one question I had, and it's the approach that we took some years ago on the Planning Commission back in probably 2010, 11, 12, something like that. The one thing I would request that happens is to maybe somehow test out some of the land value estimates that come out of some of the assessors' information, because a very large percentage of the properties haven't been physically appraised in now almost 30 years. They've just been computer adjusted. I know that there's been some properties I've looked at recently where the market value shows up as being probably half of what it really is supposed to be. So that's one little challenge that I'd like to see us, because if we're going to rely on this data, we need to understand that it's good, solid results. And that's the one flaw. And I know Becky knows that because we've talked about it before. So that's the one kind of concern I have with the analysis is can we prove it out a little bit more with somehow checking the assessed values? That's kind of it, John. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I do want to note we have in, it's a really good point. It's a little harder with commercial property to get good like sales transactions to compare to. When we look at residential areas, we'll often like grab some sales transactions, compare that to the assessed value, and they are often, there's often a difference. Usually the assessed value, or the assessor's estimate of market value, not the assessed value. The assessor's estimate of market value is often below what it actually sold for. I'll see what we can do on the commercial front, because your point is well taken that assessor's data is not a great proxy for market value, and to the extent it's wrong, it's usually wrong low, not high.
Bill.
Yeah, earlier today, your counterparts in Springfield gave a similar kind of presentation on the work that they're doing along these same lines. So great job. I mean, I think this is really terrific work. One of the things that you had in there too was like the vertical housing tax credit and maybe SDC adjustments as maybe other tools that could be considered. And I'm always like kind of like looking for gravity, right? So easiest way to get things done that achieve our policy objectives at least or no cost. Why I like John's recommendations about MUPD. If you expand it, nobody uses it, you know, it's not an effective tool. If they do take advantage of it, you can always dial it back or tweak it somehow or whatever, if it's, you know, abused in some way. But there are some things I think the city could do. And I don't know if you guys have looked at this. Now, I know that in C2 zoning, I believe if you have vertical mixed use, there's a requirement that 20% of the ground floor of the building has to be in commercial use. Has there been any thought about, hey, what if that was just waived? Portland did that recently, where I think they waived that kind of requirement and relied more upon a design ethic. I know there's been all residential kind of developments that have, even on real busy streets along River Road, there's been a few recent developments that have kind of fit in pretty well. That vertical mixed use can be expensive, and it triggers all sorts of building code related things. And I know I've heard this before from Rick, just about, hey, do we have, really that much demand for more commercial space? It looks great if it works, but if it doesn't work, then are we just sort of adding more to a plentiful supply that we have of commercial uses elsewhere? So I don't know if that's been thought of. And then even with SDCs, I know the city did establish, when they developed the transportation SDC program, about providing credits for projects that are adjacent to or along a transit corridor and then proximate to it. But then the city didn't fund that fully. So I know when we built a project a couple of years ago, we literally banked upon that we were going to be able to get this credit, locked in our financing, and then we're told, sorry, the money's already been consumed by this 12-story student housing tower. And so, there was no more money to be had. There were probably a dozen projects that given year that I think probably had applied for and thought they were going to be able to get this credit, and the city just didn't fund it. That's something I think at the other end of, say, like the MUPT, where there's really just an opportunity cost. This is a bigger deal that the city needs to budget for it and have it come out of some account. But there's pretty healthy budgets for STCs in pretty much every one of the accounts for where those are collected.
Yeah. To your second point, my understanding is that the council at the very end of 2023 removed that cap on SDC adjustments for compact development. So that is good news. It's a recent change for exactly the reasons that you just explained. For the requirement for ground floor commercial for mixed use in C2, it's a great point. I think climate-friendly areas are definitely going to require, that designation is definitely going to require some changes to C2. It is the most predominant zone, the closest to the climate-friendly areas recommendations. So we'll, how expansive they are certainly remains to be decided, but I'm certain that C2 will be part of that. So I think it's a great opportunity to say we're opening up C2 anyways, so let's look at other barriers potentially to getting this type of development that we're looking at. So I think that's a great point. I think it can certainly be part of the conversation when we look at code amendments for climate-friendly areas.
There's different ways to do it too, where you maybe have a horizontal mixed use. We have some commercial pocket, and then commercial outbuilding kind of a thing that supports a residential building that's otherwise all residential, and be much more cost effective to build.
Yeah, good feedback.
Yeah, I'm going to support what Phil was talking about, because I know probably, I'm going to say almost 2 decades ago on the Planning Commission, we asked the same question: how much commercial is the amount of commercial needed? And nobody really could come up with that answer. It was like, well, it's kind of done everywhere, so we ought to still do it. And yet I think the market is changing for commercial. There's destination type commercial, and then there's the Amazons of the world that a lot of people shop at. So simply having it in the code because other places have it in the code is not a good reason to try to support some number without any information or facts. Maybe Echo Northwest has got some studies or could do some work to find that out and give us some ideas of what really is needed in different areas for commercial, because the idea that you simply need commercial for walkability, I'm not sure there's a direct connection between the two.
Yeah, and Heather's not here to speak to some of the analysis for, how much land we expect to need for commercial or other jobs related uses, but we'll be bringing that back to you all in the next handful of months with kind of the draft work around the employment opportunities analysis. That'll look at those questions of how much retail, how much commercial, how much of that type of land should we be planning for the next 20 years. So that conversation is coming up.
Yeah, and to both those people's points, I know that there was one of the developments of the student housing that just got built. When I was on planning commission, they were trying to use ground floor commercial to get around parking requirements, because if you had ground floor commercial, you could use some of the spaces, you had to build less spaces because of the residential. It was the one on Patterson or Hilliard and they were going to build like a office for their rental thing. And we said, no, that's not really commercial, but they were using it to get around the parking requirements. I think that probably went away with CFAC, now that parking is there. But I mean, it's just another example of having to wiggle the code to make it so that your building can pencil out, right? They were like, we needed to have reduced parking. So, okay, this ground floor space that is really going to be used for the tenants' amenities, we'll call that retail so that I can reduce my parking things. We shouldn't have to manipulate the code in order to get the housing built. So if we're opening it up, let's look at some of those loopholes. Let's talk to some of our developers and some of our land use planners or people that use the code and try and get it to say what makes it easier and makes more sense. We don't want to just have it a free-for-all, but you shouldn't have to build a broom closet so that you can say, I can build this project. All right, are we ready to move on? Okay.
I'll just quickly do some next steps. And Becky, I actually have it pulled up so I can share my screen really quick, but you all can see that. So I'm glad that you all think that council would enjoy this, because we're going to bring it to them, which is exciting. So Becky and her team are working through, these final refinements, any feedback from today, making sure we got version control all figured out. And then we'll be bringing this probably a little bit scaled down version of this presentation to the Planning Commission at the end of August. And then we just got on the calendar for council in September. And that'll be their first kind of introduction to climate-friendly areas as well. So it'll be a little bit of that background on climate-friendly areas and the climate-friendly areas study, and then how this redevelopment analysis will inform their ultimate recommendation. Becky's team is also working on the final piece of this, which is around estimating that redevelopment capacity. So I think, Howard, you mentioned that earlier, really understanding how much capacity we can expect from some of these areas, higher density units. And so we're asking you all to hold your first meeting in August 1st, to potentially bring those back to you. And Heather can speak a little bit more to how some of this will get incorporated into efficiency measures and the housing capacity analysis, and how we're planning for development potential and in some of these areas, knowing that we have more analysis to do in other parts of the city for sure. So we'll be continuing to do that. We're also continuing on some community engagement around mixed use centers generally, and then more specifically on climate friendly areas, potential benefits and burdens of encouraging that type of development. And then this is really the first piece of urban growth strategies we're looking for a decision from council on, or at least direction. So we'll be asking the Planning Commission for a recommendation and City Council for direction on climate friendly areas by the end of the calendar year. And then in 2025, we'll work on those code amendments, plan amendments, comp plan policies, all that good stuff to actually implement the new designation, and definitely depending on how broad we go with how many zones could be affected by the new designation, and bringing those into concurrence, and then going into adoption with the rest of urban growth strategies in 2026. So this is definitely the first piece moving forward, and a lot more to come on urban growth strategies to you all over the coming months, and that is detailed at the end of your agenda, some of the topics that will be coming to ETAC in the near future on urban growth strategies.
Questions? So I have a question. As far as the you said this presentation is going to go in front of council when they get back in September.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know how that coordinates with their timeline on I'm going to just call it MUPD Light? Because I know that that's coming before them, probably before break.
Yeah, so this won't be integrated with that decision. So the decision to do what's called an accelerated MUPD down in the downtown core and fee assistance in the downtown core is kind of moving on its own path. The results of this analysis will really be to support further conversations over whether council wants to consider MUPD or other financial incentives to support development and redevelopment in other parts of the city. We tested downtown under those conditions because we knew we needed the development capacity estimates for to use that work as an efficiency measure within our urban growth boundary planning. But that is kind of moving on its own path. And if council chose to explore MUPD in other areas, that would kind of happen as a part of later work within urban growth strategies, or even longer term as a part of our housing production strategy, which will be our kind of 8-year adopted work plan to support housing production in a little bit more distant future.
So accelerated MUPD could move forward, and then we could say, okay, we want to plug accelerated MUPD into Midtown. We want to plug accelerated MUPD into Valley River or whatever. The tool would be there and available to be used.
That would be an option available to council. Yep.
Okay, Howard.
I'm not all that conversant on LUBA, but I guess we all know Land Use Board of Appeals rejected city's ordinance. I guess it mainly pertained to middle housing, but I don't know if it has any other impact. But I'm just curious how all that affects moving forward. I don't know if you can comment on that or not, but I'm curious about that.
Yeah, LUBA did remand our middle housing code amendments last week. So we're still in the 21-day appeal period. So our current middle housing code still stands through the end of that appeal period. And then we'll have to make a decision over whether to appeal that decision or to make other adjustments. So they're still in that decision-making process about how to proceed, and have another couple of weeks to get there. And then I'm sure we'll put out communication with those next steps in the next few weeks.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Phil.
Just a question. If I really wanted to geek out on, some of the data behind all this, rents and, certain assumptions, is that something I can just ping you for, Leah, or Becky directly, or is that right?
Not pictured in Leah's next steps list is us drafting that documentation to provide to the city. So I would say right now, no, but yes, it will absolutely be a product as part of our kind of final package that puts this all together.
This is the Geek Squad.
Geeks welcome. Yep.
All right. Well, with that, I think we're going to finish early, which is exciting. Thank you all. Let us know about August 1st. If it doesn't come together, I don't think anybody will be too disappointed, but if it does, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good job.
Bye-bye.